And so that'll just be available for further review. So welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Before we launch into today's agenda, I just want to go over one important piece of information, which is the antitrust statement, which you can see on your screen. It's about how this initiative will not enter into any discussion or activity that infringes on any applicable competition law. So I'll just give a moment there for that for you to read that. And great. So our agenda, we've got a packed full agenda today. I think there's a lot of good information for us to go through and a lot of opportunity for you to ask questions and respond as well. So in the first part, we'll just go over the Global Food Loss and Waste Challenge. I know for some of you, you're already well on board with that, so you can just consider that a refresher. Part 2, we'll go over the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative in detail. Part 3, we'll get into some of the existing activity that's out there in terms of food loss and waste reduction and what's already being done successfully. And then in part 4, we'll really dig into the notion of measurement and getting started with food loss and waste measurement. So before we go into that agenda, I do just want to give a moment to Craig Hansen, who's the Vice President for Food, Forest, Water, and the Ocean at WRI, to welcome you all and say a little introduction. So Craig.
Great, thank you, Brian, and welcome everyone to the Module 1 of the training sessions for 10 by 20 by 30. As you know, for each module, we will have a number of different training sessions, given the fact that people are, have book calendars and are different parts of the planet. And so if one of your peers misses this one, we'll be having several others of Module 1 before we move on to Module 2. And as Brian said, this is also being recorded. So in your free time, you can actually also catch up, so to speak, by watching and listening to the recording. I'll let Brian tell you more about WRI and 10 by 20 by 30, but just want to let you know that by being part of the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative, you have basically signed up, you and your retailer customer have signed up to something that's really the talk of the town. Everywhere I go nowadays, whether I'm at the Consumer Goods Forum or some other venue talking on food loss and waste, this is the initiative that's catching the attention because we've been able to line up some of the biggest and most important players in the world's food systems, yourselves included, to actually take major steps to take a bite out of food loss and waste. As you'll hear from Brian, it's a big issue. So welcome. Always feel free to reach out to any of us at the World Resources Institute if you have questions, need advice, or help as you embark on this journey to having food loss and waste. Brian, back to you.
Thanks, Craig. I think that's a great starting point. So I will launch right into part 1. So about WRI. For those of you who don't know us, WRI stands for World Resources Institute, and we are a global research organization that turns big ideas into action at the nexus of environment, economic opportunity, and human well-being. So our first office was located in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm based, although obviously not in the office at the moment. But since then, we've opened a number of international offices and program offices throughout the world on every populated continent except Australia. And so a little bit more about us specifically as it revolves around food. So WRI has worked extensively on the issue of food loss and waste, serving as the Secretariat for the Food Loss and Waste Protocol, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. We're the Secretariat for Champions 12.3, which is a coalition of executives from the public and private sectors who are all committed towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3, which is to have food loss and waste by 2030. And we'll be talking about that later more too. Also, that Champions 12.3 was the catalyst for this 10 by 20 by 30 initiative. And then we're the authors of a number of leading food loss and waste publications. So when we talk about there being a global food loss and waste challenge, what do we mean? Well, there are a lot of aspects to that. First of all, 1/3 of all food is lost or wasted each year at the global level. Food loss and waste costs the global economy $940 billion each year, About 8% of annual greenhouse gas emissions are due to food loss and waste. So putting that in context, if food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the third largest emitter globally after China and the US. The world throws out 1 billion tons of food each year, while 1 in 9 people globally remain malnourished. And food loss and waste has only elevated on the agenda since the COVID crisis began, as I'm sure you've seen articles like this about the dumped milk and smashed eggs and animals that had to be killed because of the effects of the coronavirus. So really now more than ever, addressing food loss and waste is a key issue on so many of these metrics. When we look at where food loss and waste occurs in the food supply chain, it really varies depending on what part of the world you're in. So you can see on the left, in more developed regions of the world, such as North America, Europe, industrialized Asia, a lot more of that food loss and waste is happening at the consumption side of the supply chain in those sort of reddish, pinkish sections. However, in places like Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's happening much more at the production and handling side of the supply chain. So the picture looks very different depending on where in the world you are. Globally, we're looking at the types of commodities that are lost or wasted. If you're looking at it by weight, fruits and vegetables come out on top, in large part because of their high water content. If you were to look at it based on a caloric basis, you would actually end up with cereals being most significant because they're very calorie dense. And then some other areas such as meat, although representing a small portion of the pie, about 4%, are significant because of the high levels of land and water and greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with those products. So it can really vary depending on what your interest is. So why should we seek to reduce food loss and waste? Well, here's that SDG target that I mentioned earlier, SDG target 12.3. So the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations, and there are an array of them. And this specific one, 12.3, aims by 2030 to have per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food loss across production and supply chains. So what are the benefits of this? Why would you do this? Well, from a social perspective, you can improve food security for a growing population, and if done in a way that redistributes food to hungry populations, you can feed additional people. From an environmental perspective, food waste helps to reducing food waste helps to conserve and protect natural resources, and also contributes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And economically, it's about increasing efficiency and avoiding unnecessary costs, and in some cases, even turning that food that would have otherwise gone to waste into new revenue sources. And so in 2017, WRI, along with our colleagues at the UK organization WRAP, quantified the business case for companies for engaging in food loss and waste reduction efforts. This was at 700 companies, nearly 1,200 business sites across 17 countries. And what we found was that 99% of the sites had a positive return on their investment, and the yields were 14 to 1. The median yield was a 14 to 1 return on investments in reducing food loss and waste. So this really is not just about doing good for the world, but it's profitable and it makes good business sense in a lot of cases. So some strategies for reducing food loss and waste. Again, we're just doing a broad overview here. We're a big fan of the Target, Measure, Act approach. So what this means is that you start with a target, you measure and share your results publicly, and then you take action based on what you're finding there. So targets, why start with targets? Well, that's because targets set ambition, and ambition motivates action. So what we mean by this is that you can set a target without knowing how you're going to get all of the way there. And it really spurs you into action and being creative and doing what you need to do to meet that target. Fortunately, in our case, we have the SDG target already setting out that for us. So in most cases, when we talk about a target for food loss and waste, we're talking about a 50% reduction by 2030. Measure, what gets measured gets managed, the old saying by Peter Drucker, who's pictured here, the famous business consultant. Measurement is really important for food loss and waste because it helps you to understand the size of the opportunity. So you can start taking action, but if you don't measure first, you don't know if the action you're taking is effective. You don't know if you're targeting the hotspots that are important, and you don't know how to track progress over time to see if you're really being successful. And so we're seeing increasing growth in who is setting targets and measuring. And this is a non-exhaustive slide showing logos of so many companies who are involved in setting targets and measuring within their own operations, probably some of your own who are on the call. And the fact that this slide is not exhaustive is actually kind of inspiring to me, knowing that we can't even fit all of the companies that are taking action on a slide when we've shrunk everyone's logos down super tiny. So it really is a growing movement. And then from there, action. What ultimately matters is action. So again, as I said, you look at what you've learned from the measurements that you've conducted, and you start putting practices into place that will help to hopefully reduce food loss and waste over time. And what I've done here is the 2-minute version of each of these. We will be going into much, much more detail over the course of this initiative. So this is just to give you that flavor of the overarching idea. So I will pause here just to see if there are any questions with this introductory material. You can either type a message into the chat, or if you raise your hand, you can unmute and ask your question verbally. As you saw with the agenda, we will have many more opportunities for Q&A throughout the course of the discussion. So no worries if you don't have a question just yet. And I'm not seeing any typed questions or hand raising just yet. So, someone has asked me, will the slides be distributed? Yes, we will be posting the slides from the session and the webinars, the links to the recording as well. All right, so I'm just going to keep moving right along since we've got plenty to cover. Next, about 10 by 20 by 30. So 10 by 20 by 30 is an initiative where the idea behind it is to massively increase private sector contribution to food loss and waste reduction. And really, the unique sort of perspective here is that we're trying to catalyze efforts up the supply chain. So what does that mean in practice? So it's an initiative where at least 10 of the world's largest food retailers and providers follow that Target Measure Act approach and engage 20 of their priority suppliers, you all on the call, to do the same, thereby having their food loss and waste by 2030. And this was inspired by an engagement that Tesco has done with dozens of their own suppliers. Yeah, so the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that there are 12 of the world's largest food retailers and providers on the slide here. After we started, we actually were able to have some additional companies join. 10 sounds better than 12 by 20 by 30. So that's why there's more than 10. Why is this important? Well, because it scales Target Measure Act from just those 10 or 12 companies all the way up to 200 plus. And it starts engaging the entire food supply chain, catalyzing that whole chain approach. And these are big names. Your big names, these companies are big names. We've got 6 of the world's 10 largest food retailers, a big geographic spread, iconic restaurants, iconic food service providers, really trying to branch out and reach as many sectors as possible. Finally, who is involved? You can already see their logos on the slide. So again, as I mentioned, this is a proven track record, starting with Tesco's work with their own suppliers, pictured here, who have begun reporting publicly and are already seeing big reductions throughout their supply chain. And at least 2 of these we're going to go over in some detail later on. So again, what the ask is for the participants What we're asking is that you adopt Target 12.3 for your own company, a 50% reduction in food loss and waste by 2030. And this applies to the entire supplier and all of its food categories. For measurement, we ask that you measure your base year and progress thereafter. In some cases, you'll already have a base year. If you've already begun measurement, you can keep that base year. And we ask that you share those results publicly. Finally, taking action to reduce the food loss and waste, and it can take a number of forms. It could be training, new technologies, changed practices, etc. So we're going to give plenty of examples of that, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to learn from your peers in that regard as well. So what the offer is in return for that ask? Well, the first is that you'll have these structured training seminars that we're doing the first of right now, approximately quarterly. We're condensing things slightly just because of the COVID crisis, but roughly quarterly. Online office hours where we'll be available for you to just come and ask questions. And if we get to a point where there's a possibility for in-person group convenings again, then we'll do some of those as well. You'll get guidance on a number of important topics, including things we've already gone over and some of these other items that are listed. You'll learn some strategies and tactics for reducing food loss and waste. You'll get access to experts in food loss and waste reduction from organizations like WRI, WRAP, and others. You'll learn from practitioners from peer companies who have already undergone this journey, some of whom are already close to hitting that 50% reduction in just a few years, and also some written case examples to learn from. And then you'll reap all the benefits of reduced food loss and waste within your own operations. So the economic, social, environmental, and really the reputational benefits of addressing food loss and waste. And so finally, that all adds up together to the benefits of not going on this journey alone, of doing it with a huge group of peers, and as a result, making big changes and seeing big results, not just in your own operations, but as it adding up to something even bigger. So here are the webinars that we'll be doing, these training modules via webinar. The one we're in right now, the Getting Started. Next, after this, in September and October, will be about quantification methods. In November, we'll really be responding to your questions that you're having about measurement and data gathering. Following that, the topic will be developing food loss and waste reduction strategies and some case examples. So it won't just be us talking at you this whole time, but again, learning from peers who have already done this. Assessing progress and refining strategies for the last major training module. And then throughout, we'll have some sector-specific trainings and webinars. So for example, if we have a lot of dairy providers who are saying that it would be very helpful to have a dairy-focused training series, then we might have a webinar just for the dairy sector. And also we might have a sort of advanced track where if you've been listening to me for the past 20 minutes and saying, yes, I've seen this 50 times already, which I'm sure some of you are, we'll provide that space for a more in-depth focus on getting that last little bit over the line for those who have already made big progress in reducing their food loss and waste. The other guidance and assistance, again, those open office hour webinars, we'll have an email inbox for questions where we'll do our very best to respond within 48 hours. And you can also contact me or my colleague, Kai Robertson, who will be speaking a little bit later on with any questions or requests that you have. So this, in the near term, is leading up to an announcement this coming September. So the Champions 12.3, the initiative I referred to earlier, holds an annual event during the UN General Assembly Week in late September, due to the links with the SDGs. At the annual event, which will be held virtually this year, normally we hold it in person in New York, but it will be held virtually on September 24th. We will announce all the participants in 10 by 20 by 30. We'll be conducting media outreach globally around that announcement, and we'll support your local media markets as well. And we can support your own press releases with content and quotes. So that's the first big public aspect to this initiative. So again, I will pause for any questions that you might have. And again, we will have more time for this, so please raise your hand if you have any questions or put them in the chat. Okay, so question of how many of the 200 companies do you have signed up already? Craig, would you like to tackle that question?
Yep, sure. This is a great question. We are getting close to the 200. There are a couple of the retailers who are just now finalizing signing up their respective 20. Just given COVID, we're a little bit behind against our original timeline, but that's because COVID came and hit everybody. And so we respect that, and people have to get things, first things first. So there's a few retailers that are just finalizing their list of 20 and the average of the 20 right now. That's why we're doing trainings this month as well as next month to allow for that ramp up.
Thank you, Craig. We also have a question about how will you be publicly sharing how much waste is our baseline? So I'll take this in the first moment, and Craig and Kai, if you have anything to add, please jump in. The reporting mechanism we intend to use is the website known as the Food Waste Atlas, which is a site that already allows companies, countries, and researchers to report food loss and waste information. It's what Tesco has already used with their providers, and we found that it works well. We already have an established template that we'll go over in a later training webinar for that reporting. We'll dig more into the specifics of what gets reported and how in future webinars, but that is the overarching ideas that will go into the Food Waste Atlas, and there will be options about how that information is presented. All right, I think we are good to go on to the next section. And again, just as a reminder, we do have 90 minutes today for this session. Hopefully you'll be able to join for the entire time. If you're not, again, please feel free to email us questions, and we will also review slides. We'll send around slides in the recording. Oh, sorry, okay. Sierra asked, is each retailer / food service provider engaging a different set of 20 suppliers? For the most part, there is some overlap, but by and large, the lists are independent. So, and some are asking more than 20 suppliers as well. So between there will be some overlaps, but beyond that, we expect to still have 200. All right, great. All right, you just have one more section from me, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague Kai so that you don't have to keep listening to me yammering on. But this section is meant to be a bit inspirational. It's about how reducing food loss and waste can be done. So here is a list of just some partial results that have occurred in food loss and waste reduction in just a short period of time. And again, I think some of the folks on the call are represented, and probably some of these numbers are even larger reductions in 2020. But just a few examples. So one example was milk losses from Nestle, who achieved a 40% reduction in an average of milk losses during transportation from farms to factories in 2017 and 2018. And what's really notable about this example is that the percentage of milk losses was pretty low already. They reduced it down to 0.2% average, which, yes, is very small. Even the starting percentage of about 0.35, 0.4 is very small. But then when you look at that benefit, that reduction over 30 countries, it's a savings of over 10,000 tons of milk. And that was a savings worth $2.6 million. And it meets the protein requirements for one day for 11.2 million people. So what I find really inspiring about this example is that even if you're already a very small percentage in absolute terms, or a very small amount in absolute, sorry, I'm not saying that right, a very small percentage, in absolute terms, it can still be quite significant. Another example, in Cameroon, the company Olam saved 500 tons of rice per year in the Cameroon supply chain. And what I find really engaging about this example is that the changes they made were very simple. It was things like new bags that were less torn to ripping and new trainings of packers and transporters to ensure that products were being packaged and transported correctly. So again, it's not always something that is a huge monumental overhaul of your operations. In many cases, just about doing what you're already doing, but doing it better. And then the Campbell's is on track to meet SDG 12.3, having achieved a 36% reduction in food loss and waste since 2017. They're reporting in accordance with SDG 12.3, which means that they exclude animal feed and biomaterial processing from their scope, which we'll explain in a little more detail later in this webinar. But really significant, impressive reductions in just 2 years. And how are they doing this? Well, this text is too small for you to read, probably, or at least too much of it to read right now. But the reason that I show this is that it really paints the picture of how it's about taking action at a number of stages within your operations that add up to a big picture. There's not going to be a silver bullet that fixes food loss and waste and cuts it by 50%, or at least in all likelihood, there's not going to be. So for Campbell, some of the examples are that they've taken bread that would have otherwise gone to waste and sold them to another company that makes breadcrumbs. They've increased their donations. They've diverted more food to animal feed. They've increased the amount of composting. So it's really about taking action at all of these different stages to add up to a bigger whole. And then just a little bit here about setting your targets. So again, targets are important because they set that ambition, and that ambition then determines your action. And I'm gonna do a little bit of math for you here, so please bear with me. This is what we're asking in terms of the target for suppliers in 10 by 20 by 30. The simplest version is that we're asking you to reduce food loss and waste within your operations by 50% by the year 2030. The indicator for that is food loss and waste as a percentage of the product and ingredient handled by your organization. So the simple version of that calculation is tons of food loss and waste divided by all tons produced. Now, I think that it's helpful to do an example here, so let me do that for you. So imagine the XYZ Corporation just calculating its base year and produced 100 tons of food in that year. So of that 100, 90 were sold as intended, 5 were donated to food banks, and 5 left the human food supply chain. So 3 of those tons that left the human food supply chain went to animal feed, and 2 went to compost. So that all adds up to 100 in entirety. The total FLW is just the 2 tons that went to compost, because under this initiative, animal feed is not considered food loss and waste for the purposes of the indicator, the 12.3 indicator. So the indicator calculation for the XYZ Corporation would be 2, those 2 tons to compost, divided by 90 plus 5 plus 3 plus 2, or 2 out of 100, 2%. So in this case, the XYZ Corporation's base year food loss and waste percentage is 2%. We'll get into, when we get to Kai's presentation about destinations, we'll talk about why animal feed and compost are considered differently. So this example might make a little more sense in the light of that, but that's what we're asking here. So the rationale behind this, why 50%? Well, because it's consistent with SDG 12.3. Again, that's the same for 2030. What base year would you use? So 2020 is preferred if you have not yet done any sort of measurement within your operations, but if you have solid data from an earlier year, you can use that data. And then why the indicator? Why did I make you listen to the math? Well, it's because SDG 12.3 for countries is a ratio. It's expressed as tons per capita. So we adjust that to reflect the business environment. So it's important to capture data on an absolute basis, just tons, but progress will be tracked based on that normalized indicator. So I will again pause there for any questions you might have, since I know that was a little bit more complex. But I'm not seeing any. I'll give it just a few more seconds. I'll just preview what we're going to talk about next. So I'm about to hand it over to my colleague, Kai Robertson, who's going to really dive deep on that measurement aspect of things. And I'm not seeing any questions coming in or any hands being raised. So Kai, I think I will hand it over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Quick thumbs up. Presume you can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Terrific. So that context was really helpful for now diving deeper into the part of defining your scope and starting to measure. So what I'm going to use as the basis for the discussion is the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard. So on this next slide, what some of you might already be familiar with is the document that Brian mentioned WRI produced in collaboration with a number of other organizations and 200 plus stakeholders. For those of you who are familiar with CGF, CGF was part of the steering committee, as were RAP and FAO. And this standard, the reason we're using it to help you in your food loss and waste journey is because it provides a common language, and that's really important because the terms food loss and waste can mean very different things around the world and across different supply chains. So in the standard, we've pulled together a common language, and I'll be talking about that shortly. And it also provides a standardized way to summarize an FLW inventory. So having a standardized way with clear requirements on what to include in your inventory gives you a consistency and transparency when comparing one inventory to another. And then also, as importantly, the standard provides some practical guidance. So the main reason, if you've looked at the standard, that it's fairly long is because there's the requirements themselves are simple and short, but the guidance is extensive to cover the wide range of situations that someone may encounter when measuring food loss and waste. And there's plenty of more material on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website. There's case studies, there's a value calculator to convert the weight into other units like GHG equivalencies, there's FAQs, there's quantification guidance, and that's all on the flwprotocol.org website. So in the standard, we have laid out 10 steps. So there's 10 generic steps in quantifying and reporting, and the one we're going to focus on today is the one you see circled in red about establishing scope. So I'll briefly touch on the other steps, just so you know what else they are and how we'll address them later. So this first step is defining the goals, and Brian has already talked about the goals in terms of SDG target 12.3 is fairly straightforward, and that why you quantify is really important because it then determines what you quantify. So the next two steps are really about what to quantify, and that's the scope webinar we're talking about. In future webinars, we'll talk more about the how. So the methods, how you quantify your FLW, gather the data, run analyses, et cetera. And then last but not least is reporting. And that's about summarizing your inventory, and we'll have a webinar on that as well. And as Brian mentioned, recordings will be available on the protocol website. And there are already some other prior recordings, actually, if you want to go dig through prior materials and are anxious to get started. On the third step, which is establishing scope. So I mentioned there's a common language, and this is the foundation of the common language. The slide may be familiar to those of you who've been reading through the standard already. So I'll quickly go through it just so everybody's on the same page. When we're talking about food, right, there is plants, fungi, animals that are grown. They have attached, as part of the food that's grown or the animal that's reared, there's the part that's food intended for humans to eat. And there are always some linked associated inedible parts that are not intended for people to eat in that particular supply chain. When food is consumed on the left side there, whether it's through sale or going through a charity, distributed and rescued to feed people, however it gets there, it's food consumed by people. What's then the scope for potential food loss and waste is what leaves the human food supply chain and is either in the green arrow, food not consumed, or the red, inedible parts, and we call those material types. And it's important when you're defining your inventory to be clear, have you included both food and the inedible parts, or just one of those two? Because obviously an inventory with only one material type is going to look different than one with two. And those material types could go to 10 possible destinations. So in talking with, again, the 200+ stakeholders, we boiled it down to 10 destinations where the material goes when it leaves the food supply chain. And these are listed in alphabetical order, and I'll go into more detail on these in a few slides. But suffice it to say, there's a box here, an additional box at the bottom of this yellow box, which just notes that the standard itself allows you to pick which material types and destinations you consider food loss and waste. And as you've heard Brian explain, for the purposes of SDG 12.3, the 8 out of those 10 destinations are considered in scope, and the food and the inedible parts are considered in scope. So that's, now I'm going to talk about a bit more scope. So when we're talking about scope, it's really these 4 components. So I touched on material type and destinations. I'll also talk about those in more detail, and time frame and boundaries. So on the time frame first, going left to right here. On the time frame, that's probably the most straightforward in that the time frame for the purposes of 10 by 20 by 30 is the period of time for which your business is reporting, and most businesses report data over a 12-month period. You can make that any continuous 12-month period, fiscal year or calendar year. And if it's necessary, as you see in the last bullet there, the annual figure could be extrapolated from data derived over a shorter time period. Just remember that you should use a representative time period and adjust for seasonality. In terms of the next item, which is material type. So again, I mentioned that food is that which is intended for humans to eat. It does include drink. This is a definition pulled from Codex Alimentarius, and we actually spent quite a bit of time talking about what is food. And this is what it is. It's that which was intended for people to consume. And the inedible parts are then the associated attached items, which is not intended to be consumed by people, which is, as you see in a picture here, the apple core, the stem, possibly the skin, depending on your particular supply chain. That is more subjective. So what's considered inedible parts does vary by culture, and it really matters only if you're trying to separate these two material types. Then it matters to be clear what have you assumed is inedible parts. A couple more points on the definition. So you might hear people talk about inedibility, and it's just really important. I want to flag here because this has come up a number of times that the inedible parts are different, not the same as inedible food. So as you see this kind of disgusting looking banana, that is in what we might call inedible food. It's no longer edible. It was intended for consumption, so it is food, but it's no longer fit for consumption. So using the language of the standard, it is food, it's just no longer edible. That's different and not the same as the banana peel. The banana peel is what we'd consider, again, in say the common US context, that's the inedible part. In some places you may eat the peel, but let's just say for the sake of this discussion, that's an inedible part. That bones, rinds, pits, and stones, those are often also considered inedible parts, not intended for consumption. And again, there's additional guidance in other places like with WRAP or others, the USDA, if you want to parse out what is food and inedible parts. So just a heads up if you go down that track to be clear on which parts we're talking about, and to be clear that inedibility always use the term parts when you're talking about inedible to distinguish it from the food. So summing up on this slide, basically what's possibly in scope is plants, animals, any and all part of the animals. And what's out of scope is any mud or stones that comes along with product harvested. Water that's added is not in scope, and neither is plant material like straw. That's a quick overview on material types. In terms of the destinations, and we'll pause at the end here for questions as well. The destinations, again, are where the FLW goes when it's removed from the food supply chain and doesn't get consumed by people. So these are all non-people-based destinations. Not all destinations, we realize, are created equal. This list is alphabetical. Just so happens animal feeds on the top, sewers at the bottom, and some of these have higher associated impacts than others. This next slide shows the definitions. I'm not going to go into each of them, but just want to make clear for at least the top two that for animal feed, what we defined as animal feed here is that which is diverted from the food supply chain either directly or after processing to animals. So that might be going to pet food, it could go to zoo animals, it might be going to make an animal feed that is then fed to livestock. What's intended to be under bio-based materials and biochemical processing, and again, the destinations are where the material went when it left your operations. So it's about the first stage of where the material went. Bio-based materials is in essence what's been converted into an industrial product. Sometimes for those of you in the meat business, that would be rendering product to make another item, soap, plastics, biodiesel, cosmetics, etc. And so I want to, in this reference of, we get this question a lot, is biodiesel then, bio-based materials, or is it maybe anaerobic digestion? Because in the process of anaerobic digestion, you also create a biogas. If your product's gone to bio-based materials to be turned into a biodiesel, which is a product, it would be bio-based material. If you're sending something to anaerobic digestion, by which you then take off the biogas as an energy source, the destination is anaerobic digestion. And then you'll see the definitions here below as well for compost, controlled combustion, which is incineration, land application, landfill, not harvested and plowed in destination, where crops are left in the field or plowed into the soil. Refuse and discards refers to anything that's unmanaged, and then there's sewer down the drain as another last destination. So how this now relates to the interpretation of 10 by 20 by 30. This sums it up. You've heard us, both Brian and I mention that the 50% reduction target applies to both food and the associated inedible parts, and it excludes animal feed and the bio-based material biochemical processing destination. So let me elaborate on this a little. In terms of both food and inedible parts being in scope, this is the interpretation by Champions 12.3, the group that Brian referenced. It's also what's been adopted by FAO and by the European Commission. The interpretation that food loss and waste applies to both food that's intended for human consumption and its associated inedible parts, which leave the human food supply chain. And one of the primary reasons for this is because Target 12.3 comes under SDG 12, and SDG 12 is focused on sustainable consumption and production, and not SDG 2, which is about ending hunger. So the goal is about targeting both food security and resource use efficiency, not just food security alone. So both food and the inedible parts attached matter for the purposes of SDG 12.3. That said, there's an important note you see in the bottom right of the slide here that says that if, and it's big if, but if you can measure the amount of food separately from the associated inedible parts, you can apply that 50% reduction target only to the food portion that leaves the human food supply chain. So that may be the situation for some businesses, especially those of you in the processing sector, where you may be able to, where you do split the food anyway in your processing. So that's an important caveat. And that flexibility recognizes that really for some entities, a significant share of the food loss and waste may be the associated inedible parts. There are bones, feathers, other byproducts that come from producing a food. So if you can leave the inedible parts out of your 50% reduction target, you should still quantify them separately. But we recognize that having the amount of inedible parts can be more difficult to achieve than having the amount of food, given a number of cultural or regulatory limitations. In terms of the destinations, I'm just going to stay on this slide for a little bit because it's important to talk through. In the destinations, the consensus is that the loss and waste covers these 8 possible destinations. And it excludes animal feed and bio-based materials, again, where the materials convert into industrial products, and it excludes those for a few reasons. One of the primary reasons for excluding those is that using inedible parts to make animal feed or to make non-food industrial products is in many cases the most efficient use and the highest value use of those materials. So to be clear, in those cases where it's food going to those two destinations, to animal feed or bio-based material, that is not considered food loss and waste for the purpose of SDG 12.3. But it's a very strong recommendation to nonetheless track the amounts going to all destinations, track the amounts going to animal feed and bio-based material, even though that doesn't count towards the target. Because in your particular business, there may certainly be opportunity to still save food from going to those destinations and to recapture lost revenue and also derive the environmental benefits of keeping that material in the food chain. Two other quick comments on this slide. One is that, as I mentioned, this definition is consistent with the approach proposed by FAO and the European Commission for country-level reporting. So if you have operations in the EU, this is what they follow. If you follow their work closely, though, you will notice that both FAO and the European Commission have a kind of asterisk around not harvested and plowed in. And because they don't have the data to track the not harvested destination at the country level, and because there's some regulatory constraints, not harvested is not within scope for the EU and FAO. However, it's very much in scope for the 10 by 20 by 30 purposes, and in other cases, because the destination of not harvested and plowed in is where a lot of potential food loss and waste is going. And so we definitely want to keep that within scope, even if it's a little harder to measure. And then my second comment, last comment on the slide is that we've heard some people ask, well, how come something like compost is included when there is higher value in that destination? So for destinations that produce, soil amendment or energy, yes, that's definitely important. It is valorized, but there are other much more efficient ways to generate that end use. So for example, if you wanted to generate energy, it's much more efficient ways to do so than growing a lot of food, incurring all the energy and embedded resources of that food, and then taking it to the process to anaerobically digest it. So that's, again, why those destinations are also in scope. So a couple more slides to just, again, make it really clear about this hierarchy of destinations for achieving SDG 12.3. This picture may be familiar to some of you. What it shows is when you're thinking about reaching that 50% reduction target based on the scope recommended for SDG 12.3, what do you do, right? So we've got the red box around those 8 destinations that are the target of the waste and the waste stream to be cut by 50%. And in essence, what you're doing is your first priority is the green arrow on top, keep food feeding people wherever possible, whether it's through sale or through donations. But to cut by 50%, this amount that's in the red box, there's really 2 steps. So we'll go one more click through onto this next slide. And in this next slide, you'll see, right? So in summary, what you want to do is you want to move material out of the red and orange destinations. First, by trying to keep food from leaving the food supply chain. So with a click, you'll see an red, orange arrow appear, right? So you want to move the material from the red and orange destinations to this dark green destination. So again, try to keep food from leaving the food supply chain in the first place. Waste prevention is the best choice. But we recognize where that's not possible. Arrow number 2 will be that you move the material from the red and orange boxes to the light green boxes. So the light green boxes being animal feed and bio-based material. So again, red and orange, bad. Move red orange to dark green. If not possible, move red orange to light green. That's the simplified way of looking at this. And this next slide is again the really super simple version with very little text to make that point clear. I'm going to move off material type and destination now to boundary, which is the 4th element of the scope. This is fairly straightforward, but again, there's 4 parts just to talk to briefly. For the purposes of 10 by 20 by 30, this is the boundary that's recommended, and that's your direct operations, so the operations owned by your company. In terms of food category, what we mean by that is that you should include all food categories relevant to your direct operations. That text will fly in a minute. In the terms of the life cycle stages, you want to include all FLW in a company's direct operations. And so what that looks like might be the site at the sites operated by your companies, whether it's a pack house in the source or the receiving country, whether it's food rejects owned by your company. It may be the FLW during transportation of the owned product. Again, it's what you own in your own operations. It doesn't include, though, does not include FLW generated at one of your upstream sites or other stages in the supply chain. Still important to measure that and to be involved in reducing FLW in other stages, but for the purposes of 10 by 20 by 30, the scope is direct operations. From a geographic perspective, the request is to include all geographies relevant to your direct operations, and from an organization perspective, what this refers to is simply the organizational units within which the reported FLW occurs. So again, the ideal here is simply to mention and include in your summarizing of the inventory, what type and number of facilities did you include? So were there 100 facilities or 10? And if there's 100, what might it have been? In this example, it's helpful to know that there are 90 manufacturing facilities and say 10 distribution centers. And this is particularly important if it's not possible to report FLW for your entire operations right away. So if you have to include any exclusions, please reference those in the boundary part of your inventory. The next slide, I'm just going to quickly touch on just 3 issues that are related to the scope that come up and for which there's guidance in the standard. And many products are thrown away in their packaging, or might be some other non-FLW material. And basically, in short, the definition of food loss and waste does not include packaging. Note boxes, wrapping, plastic containers are not considered food or inedible parts. So the standard requires users to exclude the weight of the packaging. And there's guidance both on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website and in the standard itself. The same is true for any kind of water added or removed from the FLW. So the FLW should be reported in the state in which it was generated before any water was added, say for cleaning or to meet your regulatory requirements to dilute the FLW. You might have to back into the number, but again, FLW, when it was generated, is the number that you want to report. And same thing if you had to remove water weight of FLW to, say, dehydrate it and have more space in your collection container, we want to report on the weight of the FLW when it was generated before any water was added or removed. And then if you are in the business of being close to the agricultural production, we require that pre-harvest losses, so any harvest losses that happened before something was ready for harvest or slaughter, should be excluded from the inventory. You may still want to track that because that's very important, but it should be excluded from your food loss and waste figure. And again, there's more guidance in the standard on all that. So I'm going to just go over a few quick examples here. This is one of Tesco's suppliers, G's Fresh Food. This is how they use the scope to visually show what's included in their time frame, their material type. They exclude inedible parts. And as you can see on the destinations, they show which of the destinations are in scope. So there's these added check marks as another way to be more clear about what's included. So G's follows the SDG 12.3 interpretation, considers all the 8 destinations, but 3 of those destinations are, for 3 of those destinations, there's no material going there. So there's a yellow check mark because there's nothing going to landfill or to sewer. And the green checks are where there is material in their inventory. So when you report on when you see somebody's figures, you want to know what destinations are included. And then you see in the boundary they were clear with what's included, and same thing with the related issues. And using G's as an example, as one of Tesco's suppliers, Tesco has asked many of its suppliers to report in short case studies. So this material is online. It's on the website that's mentioned on the bottom of the page. And from one year to the next, you can see that G's has reported their data by destination. It's the second and the fourth circles from one year to the next. From one year to the next, they were able to find a 22% reduction based on the percentage of production. So the 14.5% is what the waste was as a percent of production in 2017, 2018, and that went down by 22% in the subsequent year to the 11.3% you see on the right-hand side of the slide. And again, this example shows you a few things, not just that they were able to achieve a reduction, but as importantly, that they report their information by destination, the second and the fourth circles. And they also, as an optional addition, report their data by category, which is the first circle, and then what you see here in the third circle. And that tells you, again, it's important to tell you what's going on in the inventory and what's included. The next slide is just a quick example for another company. Gee's is in the vegetable and salads business. This one is Cranswick, who is a meat supplier. And it looks different because they have, and you can see in the second circle, all of their food loss and waste going to anaerobic digestion. And Cranswick's one of the biggest meat producers in the UK. They produce, report on their, again, production tonnage, which is the top figure, and then the percent of food waste as a percent of production, and the overall food waste. In their case, they also exclude the inedible parts. Similarly, they were able to, in 1 year, to achieve a 20% reduction. And I'm not going to go into detail on these, but again, that's all available on the Tesco supplier websites, publicly available if you want to look at the case studies. So in summary, here is a recommendation of what to measure and report for 10 by 20 by 30. The recommendation is that you report 4 things: the overall tonnage of FLW, the absolute figures, because as you saw in the prior examples, that it's important to know what the absolute weight is. But as importantly, and as Brian mentioned, what's being tracked in terms of what's being to be reduced by 50% is the tons of FLW as a percent of tons produced. And the asterisk gives you the exact details about what should be in that denominator. The third item to report is FLW amount by destination, which you saw in the 2 previous case examples. And then really importantly as well is, even though, as we talked about, donation is not food waste, nor is animal feed, nor is bio-based material biochemical processing, it's important to separately report and track the amount of surplus food that is redistributed, whether it's to charities or commercial organizations, and that which is diverted to animal feed and or the biomaterial biochemical processing. So, like for example, in the Cranswick example I showed, when you go to the Food Waste Atlas, Brian mentioned, you'll see that they report on the amount that goes to the animal feed into the bio-based material destinations as well. And then we also, and there's the recommendation would like that you clearly define and report using the FLW standard, both the scope for your own operations and then the methods and assumptions. In the future webinars, we'll talk a bit more about both the methods and also the nitty-gritty of reporting. Best practice as optional recommendations are to also report the tonnage by product categories, as you saw Gee's and Cranswick do, and then to provide any detail of assurance undertaken, as that does enhance confidence in the quantification. And where to go for more guidance, so in addition to what Brian and I were sharing, are the FLW protocol website, where you can find the executive summary circled in purple there. And that's the short 12-page version that, if you haven't read it, is a good one to read, to really familiarize yourself with the requirements. The material is available in multiple languages if you need to translate it. And there's, again, case studies, tools, trainings, FAQs, and then a link to the Food Waste Atlas as well. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, Kai. I see we're just about at the 1 hour mark, so we've got half an hour left. And I think it's a great moment to pause and see if there are any questions. So I'm seeing one in the chat. In the Campbell's example, the company reduced food waste in part by anaerobic digestion and composting, but under 10 by 20 by 30, I should say. You wrote WRI, but it's under 10 by 20 by 30, and the Champions 12.3 considers it food waste. Will companies be required to retract their claims if composting or anaerobic digestion is now considered waste? So I should clarify, there's nothing that needs retracting. They have moved items from landfill to anaerobic digestion and composting, which under the hierarchy that Kai shared, that is still beneficial. Campbell's has still defined items that are going to anaerobic digestion as composting as food loss and waste. So that was what I shared when they said that the destinations that were included in their figure, it was shown on that slide. So they are consistent internally on that, and so that was accurately reported. So no, they will not have to retract any sort of claim on that front.
Brian, can I make a quick comment on that?
Yes, of course.
So because I get this kind of question quite a bit, composting is still good. Anaerobic digestion is still good. That's why they're in the orange boxes, because there definitely is some valorization. So the goal is to cut the food that was intended for people in half to those destinations. That still leaves another 50% in those destinations. So when Campbell's shares what they're doing, they're talking about the benefit they are able to get by, as Brian mentioned, moving material possibly out of landfill to anaerobic digestion or to composting, which is a better alternative. It's just not the most preferred, right? So it is, as you see in that pyramid, kind of a hierarchy of options. I hope that helps clarify too.
Yes, thank you, Kai. And thank you, Jocelyn, for the question. Any other questions or comments? Feel free to either raise your hand if you'd like to ask them out loud, or just share them in the chat. And of course, if after this presentation is done, something comes to mind as a question, please, again, feel free to reach out to us directly. Not seeing anything, so either everything was super, super clear, or there's, or people are just thinking. Okay, so
actually, Brian, there's a question that came to me.
Okay, one came to me as well. It might be the same. Go ahead.
All right, then go ahead. You go first.
So this question is, so diverting waste to animal feed or donation does count positively toward our goal. Was that the question you received as well, Kai? Yes?
Yep.
Okay. So the short answer is yes. If you're moving it out of this red box up into this area, it counts positively as a food loss and waste reduction for the purpose of the 12.3 indicator. Also, as what we see on this screen is that in the lower left-hand corner, this is actually a great example of how first, it would be much better for that food to go to donation. So the number one in that corner of moving from the red and orange area down here up to the dark green. Then if it's not possible, then yes, you go from there into animal feed. Kai, is that a fair summary?
That's correct. Yep. And again, you know, the spirit of it, of the entire effort is to keep more food in the food supply chain. Either, you know, because feeding people is the first objective, whether that's through, you know, revenue generating opportunity or recapturing it for donation. And then if, you know, they're understandably not all, we're not trying to get to, you know, zero anything, maybe zero waste to landfill, but we're not, you know, there's still going to be food that's not safe and shouldn't be fed to people. And the best possible use may be compost. But it's that kind of constant questioning of, is this the best possible use? Could I have given it to people either through donation or through sale? And then going down the hierarchy.
Thank you, Kai, and thank you for the question. I'll start going over some of what we're asking you to do for next time, and just see if any other questions pop up. But let me get back to the correct slide. So what we're going to ask that you attempt to do before our next conversation is, some of you may have already done this, is to graphically show the scope of what your inventory will be using the FLW standard. And so here's what that means. So this is going to be the template based on that recommended scope to meet target SDG 12.3. This again is covering, we're going to share this set of slides. So this is all stuff that we've already talked about today, but this is going to be available in a downloadable form for you. And so this template, as we've discussed, is for you to share your own information. So this is the suggested 10 by 20 by 30 interpretation of what destinations to include, what material types, and what time frame. And what we'll have for you, I believe on this next slide, yes, is a customizable version. So this is a fairly busy slide. You don't need to read it all right now, but basically anything in red is where you'll be able to fill in your own time frame, your own food category, life cycle stage, geography, organization, etc. And then for the scope, you have those little green check marks that you can drag to whichever destinations are within scope. Again, we've already highlighted which are the 8 that we think will be there. And then you can also use that other color check mark for things that are in scope, for destinations that are in scope, but none of your FLW actually goes there. So in a lot of cases, things like not harvested might not be part of your operations if you're not at the production level. So we will share this document with you for you to produce your own template of your own scope. Your own document of your own scope. If you've already done this in reporting with the FLW standard, as I know some of you have, then that's a possibility as well. And I'm seeing a question coming through into the chat. So let me look at that. For some reason, the chat box is not wanting to come up for me. There it is. Okay. Well, that was just a private comment. So we will share this, distribute this, this template for you to use within your own operations. And again, don't worry about getting it 100% perfect. We're available for questions if you have them. And we will, again, be going into this in the next conversation as well when we talk about quantification methods. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming in or any hand raising. So I think we can conclude today's session. Thank you all so much for participating in this initiative. We're so excited. I hope you are too. This is really a big deal to have so many of the world's leading food companies taking this bold step to take this action within their operations, and we're really excited to be part of it. So again, we will share the recording of the webinar, we will share the slides, and we will share that template as well for distribution. So thank you all so much for joining. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. So thank you all so much for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks.